Okay, today we're going to have a look at 10 things you can write about in your AQA GCSE English Language Paper 1 Question 2. It's the one about language, where you'll be asked to write about 3 things: words and phrases, sentence forms, and language techniques. You've only got about 10 or 12 minutes at the most to tackle this question, so you need to get quick at spotting the kind of things that you can pick out. Basically, you need to repeatedly pick out examples or quotations, label them with the correct terminology if you can, and most importantly, explain what the effect is of the word or phrase or technique or sentence construction that you've picked out. What was the writer trying to achieve? What's the reason why they've used that example of language? If you can look for a pattern or thread running through the author's use of language by linking some of your examples together, then that's also brilliant. We're going to have a look at a passage from A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It's just our example of a text. Now, this is harder than the text that you'll have in the exam, so I'm going to explain a few of the words or phrases, but don't worry if there's the odd bit that you don't understand. Let's read it. It's a short passage like you'll get in the exam, and it's from the beginning of the text where Scrooge is being described. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheek, stiffened his gait. Made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. We're going to start by looking at sentence types and constructions. First of all, look at the 2 exclamation marks in the opening couple of lines. You can make a point about them. Always look for different types of sentence and use A-level terminology too when you're labelling them. So if you find an exclamation mark, it's an exclamative. A question is an interrogative, and a command is a directive. The verb within the directive is called an imperative. So look at the dog is a directive, and look, the verb in that directive, look is the imperative or the imperative verb. What's important though is that you give a reason. Let's look at the passage again. Dickens writes, "Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner." So what effect do the exclamatives have here? Well, I would write that they intensify the emotion. They emphasise that he's so shockingly mean that the narrator can barely express it. Sticking with sentence constructions, we could also look at the use of lists. Look at a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. There's a long list here, mainly of words ending in ing, which are called present participles, and they're being used here as adjectives to describe Scrooge. What effect do they have? Well, again, it's one of emphasis. Dickens is emphasising how mean-spirited and miserly Scrooge is, and he's piling on adjective after adjective in order to do it. We could also look at the syntactic parallelism here, which is another aspect of sentence structure. And syntactic parallelism just means repetition of structure. Look at "no wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty." Can you see this? The structure of each clause is repeated. It's more or less the same structurally. It's also in a list of 3, so we can call it a tripartite sequence. Again, make sure you show the points that Dickens is making. Why has he used that sentence structure? And here it's that Scrooge is harsher, bitterer, and more malicious than the worst weather imaginable. The last 2 sentences in our passage are, the heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely and Scrooge never did. Now, you could comment on the polysyndetic coordination here. That just means the repetition of and which is a coordinating conjunction. And the wordplay too. There's a bit of a joke at the end, which you probably wouldn't have got, but to come down handsomely means to fall heavily in the case of the rain, but in relation to Scrooge, the fact that he never came down means that he never gave in. He was very stubborn, never relented. So we could comment on the wordplay as well. So what else have we got? Well, there's a couple of similes. There's a metaphor too, but let's look at the similes. Look at hard and sharp as flint, or solitary as an oyster. In both cases, you'd need to pick them out and say what these similes suggest or imply about Scrooge. So for solitary as an oyster, for instance, maybe you could say that it suggests that he's a tightly closed up private man, keeps himself locked in his shell. Finally, what could you say about some of the individual words and what they might be suggesting about Scrooge? Here, it might be an idea to say what word class they are as you're commenting on them. Don't get obsessed with this because the point you make about them is far more important. But if you're making a point about, for instance, nipped, shriveled and stiffened, call them verbs and then explain how they seem to shrink Scrooge into a closed up hard man physically, as if his internal character is evident in his physical appearance. So, we've looked at these things today. There's a fair chance that you might be able to spot them in your exam, but there are other techniques and features of language, of course. You just need to practice finding them. So don't just sit there listening to YouTube tutorials. Open a book and start analysing language like you'll have to in the exam. If you found that useful, like it, share it, and subscribe to English Gorillas.